Hello, greetings. Welcome back to Crusade Against Ignorance. Today, a new guest, but a special guest, my friend Drew. Drew, how's it going? Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me on, Micah. I've been doing pretty well.
Good, awesome. Yeah. So today we're going to be as well. I don't know why people always do this. I mean, you kind of know what the video is about because you clicked on it, given the title. So unless I was tricking you and just want to do something else, which would be an interesting philosophical video to make. But anyways, today, as you will have gleaned by this point, we are talking about Sorites paradox and vagueness more broadly, why these things are important, what they are to start with, and where they can apply in some other areas of philosophy and why it's important to think about them. So unless there's anything else preliminary, let's jump right in. Drew, why don't you tell us what Sorites paradox is?
Sorites paradox is it's a paradox concerning description. A description of whatever the denotation or the connotation in using modern terms of a thing are. It's basically, to summarize it briefly, it's usually explained with the analogy of the sand heap. Like, you don't know epistemically or even metaphysically at what point a sand heap is formed when you keep on putting different sand grains on top of an already existing pile. It's kind of like that. Like, there is no boundary to certain terms and certain essences that we use to designate certain things. And that's where the Sorites paradox comes in. When there's no boundary for the term of a thing, then whatever builds upon the term can be used interchangeably with basically the thing in question.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, normally these things are run, if you were to lay it out like premise by premise, it usually starts with something like, well, one grain of sand doesn't make a heap. And that's sort of generally uncontroversial, right? Like if I just put a grain of sand down, it's like, well, that's not a heap of sand. That'd be wrong. And then it's like, well, what if I add another one? Fill 2 grains of sand. So then usually the next premise would be like, well, if 1 grain of sand's not a heap, then 2 grains of sand isn't a heap. And then if 2 grains isn't, then 3 isn't, and so on and so forth. And it goes on and on. And usually it's kind of, you skip the premises and it gets all the way up to say, like, well, if then adding the millionth grain of sand does not make a heap. It's like, well, obviously something's gone wrong here because we have a million grains of sand. We want to say it's a heap of sand. So, but the question then is, at what point does it become a heap, or even does it? So there's kind of like our terms are vague and replying, and it can also be run backwards. So like if taking 1 grain away from a million doesn't make it not a heap, then taking all of them away doesn't make it a heap. So then you kind of lead to these absurd conclusions, like, well, then once you take away the last grain of sand, you still not remove the heap, or something like that. So it just kind of gets absurd quickly, laid out premise by premise form. So, all right, Drew. Well, when people first hear about this, like when you talk about this to people who maybe aren't super interested in like metaphysics or epistemology, and just kind of you kind of want to talk about kind of maybe more in like a common language sense, what they might say at first is just like, who cares? Why is this important? So do you want to explain briefly like why this is important to think about, why like vagueness is something that we kind of need to take account of?
Yeah, and I'd also like to address my descriptive explanation of Sorites paradox and its bare bones previously. I want to correct myself. I probably made a really bad explanation out of it, but I think what is highlighted here is the sand heap example, which is what really highlights it, and the non-boundary aspect of it. But to answer your question as to why Sorites paradox is important, is because in everyday observation and even in scientific empirical testing, we always use terms to designate the diachronic identity of real existence. But if I point to, like, say, like I said, a heap of sand, and I tell you, well, at which quantity would make it just a half a heap? And when someone is trying to answer, they'd be like, oh, well, you could just slice off the top half and the bottom half is the other half. But at the same time, there's still layers, like almost infinite layers of that sand heap that you have to possibly tear off in order to make the half heap. And it's really just important for identifying concepts and identifying the things by which those concepts correspond. And I mean, and if we don't recognize that, if we don't recognize the importance of defining things with a boundary, then, well, then any term that we utilize in either metaphysics or epistemology or even science or common or everyday observation will be completely muddled, and it'll be such a linguistic ambiguity, no one would know what they were talking about with each other.
Right. Yeah, no, this is when I had some friends press me on this because they were just like, well, why does it matter? I was like, well, you think about like all the terms we use that are vague. I mean, you think about it less in terms of like a logical paradox, because that sounds boring to some people. If you just use like, say, hey, well, vagueness, like vague terms, like you use these all the time. Like one common example people give for Sorites is like a bald person. There's a person with like one one strand of hair, like they're usually call them bald, but it's like, well, then at what point do they become a non-bald person? And so there's so many of our concepts, and then yeah, but then so for everyday usage and using language properly, there is obviously important. But then especially for philosophers, it's interesting because there's issues in metaphysics, as you mentioned already, issues in epistemology, our use of language, as you said, like our kind of our meaning of semantics, semantic content of like the terms we use, and also even for logic, because as we'll see in a little bit, we'll talk a little bit more about this. Kind of Sorites paradox leads some people to want to challenge like binary truth and falsity forms of like classical logic. So there's a lot to get into, and we'll talk about some of our favorite cases. But do you want to go over, or we can talk a little bit about like the four kind of broad types of response people want to give? I have those written down. So you want me to read them out, and you can talk about them, or you just want to go ahead and give them?
Yeah, you give them out,
Okay.
and I'll give a response.
Yeah, I read the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry and wrote it all out, so we were ready. So basically, the four broad types of response that philosophers like to give to the Sorites paradox is first is just to deny the applicability of logic to cases like this, just to say like logic doesn't apply, like our truth falsity binaries and our classical logic, it just doesn't apply to these cases. These terms are too fuzzy. They're not black and white, true, false. They're fuzzy terms. The second option is just rejecting some premise of that argument. So you end up rejecting, like, I don't know, you pick a number, right? Like, if 3 grains of sand don't make a heap, then 4 doesn't. Well, say you just reject that premise, and you're like, okay, well, four grains do make a heap. So that's one of the responses, to reject one of the sum premise. Doesn't matter which. Just got to figure out one. But that's kind of where it gets interesting, because it's like, why? Because there's sort of the arbitrariness problems there. And then the third is just to deny that it's a valid argument at all, or a valid problem to even raise. And then the fourth, the kind of scary option, is just to embrace the paradox. Is just to say, well, okay, well, any of our vague terms are they're incoherent or vacuous or meaningless. So yeah, you can either deny the applicability of logic to these kinds of paradoxes. You can just reject some premise, which seems to be kind of one of the more popular, or you can just deny its validity, or you can just go with full-on embracing the absurdity. So, do you want to say anything more about those?
Um,
Maybe a little bit about, like, for one thing, why embracing the absurdity is a bad idea, but just, yeah, all of them in general.
I think the first objection is completely incoherent, just absolutely incoherent, because not only does it assume an extremely controversial metaphysics, but also, and Joe actually was talking about this in the group chat. He said that when it comes to abstract entities, they have a necessary correspondence with their with the actual existent, not to make a presupposition of the correspondence theory of truth, but that there is some sort of necessary link between the abstract entity or the concept and combinations of concepts with the actual existent in question. So obviously we know, so then obviously we can infer that there is, or at least it entails, that there is a pretty cemented relationship between an abstract entity and its respective object. So objection one, just out the window right there. Objection two is interesting, and I can see why it is the most popular one. Um, but it does beg the question as to what premise we have to reject.
Mm-hmm.
What premise do we have to reject? Because the absurdity of Sorites paradox is that it's almost like the Zeno's paradox of motion. Like Hercules with the turtle has to go through an infinite set of motions just for one step, and it's just like that. You have to put almost infinite number of sand grains to make a sand heap. So we can't really find a premise in that, and if we do, then how can we ground that premise, or how can we ground our rejection of that premise? I mean, what exactly is the justification for it? Why exactly is 3 grains of sand not a heap, but 4 is? Like, to make of your example. I mean, obviously we know there's a distinction in kind. Like 4 is obviously not 3; it's not equivalent. But at the same time, there's a disjunct you can make. Either the heap is 4 or 3, And if you reject 3, you have 4. But at the same time, it doesn't necessarily follow that it's a heap, especially if you can't already define a heap in general. It's sort of like that's another thing. It sort of presupposes that the heap already exists with 4 grains of sand, which is also just blatant question begging.
Right. Yeah. Ooh, yeah. Because I don't. That's interesting to think about it in terms of like a grounding relation. Because like, what would ground the fact that 4 makes a heap, but 3 doesn't, and 5 doesn't, or 5? I guess 5 would be a heap, or like a bigger heap, or something. It is strange because that's kind of the route I want to go, and we'll talk about proposed solutions. But like, say if you're going to be like Timothy Williamson and be an epistemicist, you're just going to say that we are going to reject some premise, but we just don't know which, because we just don't have we don't know at what point it becomes a heap, but we know that at some point it does. We can kind of preserve binary, classical logic, and we can kind of make it a little easier. But we'll talk about some proposed solutions. What about 3 and 4? You have anything on those? We should move on to denying validity or embracing the absurdity.
3 and 4, I also have problems with as well. With 3, honestly, the same exact objections I made at objection 2 can be transferred to objection 3 against the Sorites paradox. I mean, the grounding relation, as you've said. I mean, what exactly justifies the reason for us to reject the logical validity of Sorites paradox? Because it is completely true, not just a priori, but also a posteriori. I can never pronounce that for the life of me.
It's a tough one for sure.
Yeah, that you see a big structure of sand grains, and you're like, oh, that's a heap of sand. Or you see individual sand grains, like 4 sand grains, and you're like, oh, that's not a heap. So we can't say that a priori or a posteriori that it isn't valid, because it completely is, especially if it's backed up by, well, just empirical everyday observation.
Yes, I'm running some down real quick. Yeah, I want to wonder now. I'm probably gonna mess up the pronunciation too, but now I do wonder if there's like an a posteriori identification thing we can do with this, kind of like along a Kripkean lines, and maybe combine that with epistemicism somehow. Like, we only know it's a heap at a certain point, but then we know that like necessarily this many makes a heap. I don't know. There's something there, but I don't have it well formulated enough to talk about. And then 4, just it's like pretty obviously we don't want to go that route. I mean, I know some philosophers do. Just saying like, well, vague terms are incoherent. Then it's like, yikes, how do we use language like ever? So yeah, that's obviously not the way we want to go. Well, I guess then we can talk, if you want to, we can go into a little bit about, let's talk about some of the solutions to it. I don't know if you have any of these. Let's just start with the one I gave first, epistemicism, Williamson's, and then you can go through a couple that you've heard and maybe what you think, why those don't work. But first, I want to hear your thoughts on this one. Yeah, so Timothy Williamson's solution is kind of a pretty popular one. And the reason it's pretty popular is that, a lot of philosophers that work on this take vagueness usually take it to be like a semantic feature of language. So if it's a semantic feature, has something to do with meaning, then logic can't exactly be classical about it. So there does have to be some sort of like something we don't have access to about it. But still, there is, a definite point at which it becomes a heap and becomes no longer a heap. But because there's kind of this semantic element to vagueness, then we can't really know what that is. So because it's a semantic phenomena, vague terms have kind of sharp boundaries that we're just not aware of, right? So that's kind of the epistemicist solution, which is pretty popular. I think it's one of the more popular solutions on offer, probably up there. And it's one that I'm most familiar with, and I've kind of liked it from when I first heard it, but I'm not like super confident in any solution to this. So yeah, what do you think about that? Taking just kind of like vague terms as being semantic, and therefore there are sharp boundaries to do with all vague terms. So yeah, I've talked about anything vague. We just can't really be aware of it. So what do you think about something along those lines?
Honestly, I would think that is a very good solution, but I think it's a little too reductive. It's a little too convenient to say that Sorites paradox is nothing but a semantic problem, and that in reality there are definite structures and definitions for the thing we express in language. I mean, like I said, like with Sorites paradox, it applies to the things we observe in everyday life. I mean, with the grains of sand in the sand heap, these are applicable to real existence, not just our mode of expressing such existence. So that's the one thing I have a problem with it, is that it's not justified in saying that is merely just a semantic problem. It's minimally explanatory in that sense, and it's not incoherent, but incomplete. It seems like an incomplete solution. Like we're definitely on the right track, but not yet there in terms of like a metaphysical solution.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting. Because, yeah, it is taken, like, vagueness itself is taken to be a semantic feature of language. But, I mean, whether or not that translates directly into how we can actually talk about, metaphysics or metaphysical reality and objects and things, that that's not, immediately entailment relation there. So, yeah, I have to think more about it, because I've always kind of liked this one, just because I think, like, when we're talking about Sorites, um, we're talking about a couple different things. So a lot of times we're talking about epistemology, language, and metaphysics kind of all at once, because we're talking about what is there that exists. Like, do heaps exist? We could be like maybe some sort of type of mereological nihilist and just say they don't. Or then we can say chairs don't exist too, because then there's how many atoms make a chair. But yeah, because we want to say like there are heaps, but it's like, well, then it becomes what are those, and then how do we talk about them? So maybe you're right to say that there is like kind of the separation between what a heap is and how we talk about it. So maybe like the semantic vagueness, when we're referring to these things, like the semantic relations are different, but doesn't really bear on that. I don't know. I'm going to think about that more. I've kind of liked that solution, but I know, but actually Kit Fine's solution sounds pretty good to me as well. So I don't know. We'll get into that. But anyways, so that's interesting to talk about that one a little bit. What are some other maybe like popular solutions to it that have been proposed that you know of that you might have issue with?
None in contemporary literature that I have seen.
Okay, yeah.
You've mostly exhausted the list, yeah.
Okay, let's talk briefly. I'm not super familiar with this one, but I'll just see what you think. So this is the one that Kit Fine's proposed in a recent little book of his I told you a little bit about before we recorded, and I think Michael Tye, the philosopher, actually helped convince him of this, which is pretty interesting. But anyway, so he contra the epistemicist, so he's not taking it as a purely semantic linguistic problem. He's taking it more as a metaphysical thing. So to that extent, he says that vagueness, instead of, we kind of tend to think of it as like a local phenomenon, like it's isolated things like heaps and our perceptions of them, and say, but he's proposing a solution where we take vagueness as a global rather than local phenomena. So global, meaning that the vagueness of an object or an expression. So, we can talk about it two ways: objects and expressions. As we said, distinguishing between the metaphysical objects we're talking about and how we talk about them. So he says that vagueness of an object or expression cannot be properly considered except in relation to other objects or expressions. So this is what Fine. I don't know like the details of his account, but this is broadly what he says. And maybe there's probably like a couple different ways to go about that are compatible with this broad framework of just saying we can't take this isolated. We have to talk about our expressions and these objects that we're talking about, to consider them globally as in relation to other expressions and ideas. So I know I'm not like fleshed this out very well, but like just broadly speaking, what do you think of that kind of approach? Do you think it's better to talk about it globally or locally?
I think honestly, it is definitely good to talk about it globally. Like I will agree with Fine on that. But we have to define what he means by globally. If what he means by globally is what is universal, like universally what affects like the vagueness of terms and the respective objects everywhere in the universe, then absolutely. Like we can consider it in a universal stage, because Fine is an Aristotelian, so he would agree with the proposition that essences are not necessarily an explanatory nature, but a constitutive nature of things within the universe. And he's trying to lead a logical road, or at least a first principle down that sort of solution, which I don't necessarily have a problem with. It's just that he definitely needs to define his terms like globally and locally a lot more sharper.
And he probably does. I've not read the whole book. I should,
Yeah.
And I want to. But yeah, I think by globally, as it says kind of later in the definition, he means that these kind of cases, like the objects we're referring to, so heaps, and then how we even refer to them, the vague expressions we use to refer to them, we have to use them, or at least take them into account in relation to other objects and ideas. And the use of global makes me think maybe, well, all other objects and ideas. There has to be kind of this broader causal. And again, I see a couple approaches being compatible with that. I don't really have any problems with it. And it seems right. Like in metaphysics and semantics and language, we do tend to want to not view things as isolated. We want to kind of think of them in relation to other objects, especially. And one reason to think about it this way, maybe something like just to think about causation, like with a heap. In order to make a heap or destroy a heap, there has to be some like external causal influence upon the heap to affect it, or the heap or non-heap to make it change one way or the other. So there kind of has to be a consideration of the global or the other objects that are coming into play. But
yeah, and that does make sense. Like there is a causal explanation that factors into objects that are applicable to Sorites paradox or indicative of Sorites paradox. I mean, yeah, I definitely agree with Fine on that. That was it, that we can't just reduce it to just particular individual things, but we have to also consider other objects that may play an influence on its being.
Yeah, I think so too. I need to work out more, but I don't think that's necessarily compatible with the epistemicist account, because that's more in terms of thinking of our expressions as sort of more locally semantic. So my two preferred solutions are at odds with each other, so I got to figure out which one I like. But I don't know yet. But well, speaking of which, let's talk a little bit about your preferred solution or your preferred way to think about it, which is I think Aristotelian as well. So you want to kind of talk about that a little bit, lay that out?
I do, yes. I honestly think the problem with approaching the paradox, the Sorites paradox, is that we always think of it in terms of its explanatory nature, or at least the explanatory elements that underlie the concept of Sorites paradox. Like we always try to look at it from an explanatory point of view, and when we try to think of it as purely explanatory, then we run into paradoxes of vague terms and constitutive confusions. But really, we have to think of Sorites paradox as constitutive. Bare bones, it is constitutive, because a heap of sand is constituted by sand grains, and that's exactly what we're trying to go for. But most philosophers approach it with, how does the grains of sand have an explanatory or causal relationship with the heap of sand, and that's where they run into trouble. What I thought of over this past week while reading Oderberg, and I know, put your pitchforks away, I'm just doing a neo-Aristotelian study.
Leave me
alone.
Essentialism, yeah, man.
Yeah, I do think an essentialist account can actually work, and I actually was talking to you about this earlier, that Sorites paradox can heavily affect the neo-essentialist or neo-Aristotelian essentialist account of essence, because we have to recognize exactly what sort of properties or what bundle of properties makes up an essential property and what is an accidental property. What's the distinction? What makes up that distinction? Why should it be that distinction, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the confusion lies in that account, is that they're confusing what is properly an essence with an essential property. An essential property just flows from the essence, and there's not much to it in that. The essential property is not the essence in question. And this applies very accurately with the Sorites paradox and the sand heap example. The essential property of being constituted of grains of sand is not equivalent to the essence of being a sand heap. And to elaborate on that further, basically, the grains of sand by themselves, like an aggregate of grains of sand, like say 4, 5, 6, etc., they're by their own very nature just grains of sand, and their other essential properties are, made up of molecules, atoms, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So we do have to make a distinction between the essence of sand grains and the essence of sand heaps. But if we try to interchange those two terms, and if we try to establish these two terms as an explanatory and causal relationship, we do run into problems. Although I will admit that my account is also minimally explanatory. I'm just saying, well, we got to make a distinction between X and Y. I will admit that. My solution is minimally explanatory, just like I said with epistemicism, but I do believe it is a step in the right direction in trying to establish justifiably what we mean when we say we see grains of sand, we see a sand heap, not only in everyday observation, but also in scientific observation as well.
Okay. Yeah, interesting. Ooh, I'm trying to decide if I want to go down the rabbit hole of just talking about essences more simply. That might be a whole nother video, just essentialism.
Absolutely. And was it I guess a lot of people sneer at essentialism because they think it implies the existence of God, but I don't think that's the case at all, and we'll save that
Yeah.
for another video. But
Yeah, we're definitely gonna have a whole video on that at least. Well, yeah, I mean, because like there's some arguments I've seen kind of that people kind of make out of Kripke, even that are plenty of non-theist metaphysicians kind of get out of Kripke. They think that like well, there's this one grad student who I'm friends with on Facebook who has a YouTube channel. His name's Graham Seth Moore. Works a lot in philosophy of language, and he does have this this like an explanation. He has a video on like identification, like theoretical identification and things like that, and how kind of Kripke would have solved some of his naming and necessity problems better if he'd gone for an essentialist account. So definitely recommend people check that video out. I can maybe link it or something. But yeah, so yeah, I think you're definitely right that essentialism isn't something that's only for theists, right?
oh, absolutely.
Definitely, and we'll talk more extensively about that. One question I did have, the only one really pressing question I had so far on your account was just, do you think, because you talked about constituents a little bit, do you think that account relies on constituent ontology, or is it compatible with relational as well? Because I read up on this and was thinking about it recently, kind of talking about classical theism. Actually, these things always come up.
Yeah.
And so a lot of like kind of Thomistic metaphysics do require constituent ontology, or that's probably the wrong thing to say, not a lot of Thomistic metaphysics, but the way people often formulate things like divine simplicity is usually works better within constituent ontology.
It does.
So
Yeah.
I don't know. So I know it works a little bit better, but do you think? But maybe that's not true for essentialism simpliciter, because I'm sure there's philosophers that are essentialists and also relationalists. So do you think your account requires constituents? Does it just work better with it, or is it fine either way?
I would say it's fine either way. It is absolutely compatible with relationist accounts, since when it posits essence, essences are just positing that it is a constitutive of a thing, and it's what allows like characteristic functions and behaviors and operations, aka the relational or causal aspect of the relationship of beings to happen. Pretty much, like it's basically like it's sort of a priority from relationism. Like the constituents is like prior to the relation, but one could also make
Okay,
the
yeah.
argument that there is a relation between the priority of constituentism and therefore self-refuting, basically saying that if there is already relation in the priorism of constitutive to relational, that implies a prior relation, which I could see that, and I'll probably just reject that now. But basically, yes. I don't want to say a constitutive structure is required for a relationship, but that I want to say a relational aspect between two things can flow from a constitutive structure of the thing, aka the essence or essential properties. Not or essential properties, like the essence and its characteristic essential properties.
Okay. Yeah. I just say the one other thing. How do I formulate this? I'll just give like a basic, just kind of like to kind of open this up for more discussion, some more food for thought for viewers. I'll just give kind of like a simple argument against essences, and then kind of try to apply them to this case. Well, I'll just give them more generally. So actually, I get this from Graham Oppie. I think I've shared this with you before, an email exchange we had, and we talked about a little bit in a video I did with him. But just kind of pushing back on the idea, like you're talking a little bit about this in terms of explanatory power, right? If we're trying to explain. So say, like what Graham said, the way he worded it was something like, when I say that, or he used it in terms of like, in talking of properties, we can translate it to essences pretty simply. So say, like when I say my chair has four legs, or then I say my chair has the property of four-leggedness. So let's talk about essences. The chair has the essence of four-leggedness. So what Graham wanted to say was, when I say those two things, when I say my chair has the essence of four-leggedness and my chair has four legs, I'm not really saying anything different in the sense that I'm not explaining anything more by positing essences. I'm positing more metaphysically. I'm adding more to my ontology by saying, well, there is a chair with four legs, but there's also a chair that has the essence of four-leggedness, or maybe those are the same thing. But still, I can kind of use the same, I can refer to the same object with equivalent clarity without having to appeal to essences. So why does my explanatory account need essences? So to translate this into talk of sand heaps, well, to say that we have a heap of sand, and then to say that the heap of sand has like the essence of heapness or whatever, I can refer to the same object with and kind of use language the same way. But so I guess the basic question boils down to, we don't have to go deeply into like anti-essentialist arguments, but why posit essences here? Why does that increase the explanatory barriers? I know you already said that, like, you kind of want to add some more on maybe to the explanatory virtues of it, but just at like the base level, like why should we even think about Sorites paradox and vagueness in terms of essences instead of just kind of the bare bones objects that we're dealing with? They say the bare bones physical objects or metaphysical objects or what have you. Why essences? That could be the basic question.
Yeah, and I would argue against those variations of anti-essentialism that it's conflating the essential properties with the essence in itself. Like when you say, a heap has heapness, you're kind of like twisting it and turning it around in an order that it's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be like heapness. From heapness flows like a heap. Is the property. Like with a chair, with chairness flows four legs. Because there are some chairs which don't even have like four legs at all. They have this like weird structure kind of.
The one I'm sitting on right now has like wheels or something. I don't even know what I would call it technically. Yeah, right.
Yeah, exactly. And you could technically count those as legs, but they would be multiple. It's a good question. Like, why posit essences for Sorites paradox? And like I said, I want to go back. Like Sorites paradox should be taken from a constitutive perspective more than explanatory or an epistemic perspective. We should really focus on the certainty of the existence of that thing rather than trying to just develop the human justifications for why it's a heap and there's sand grades, et cetera, et cetera. And that's exactly why I believe we should definitely use essences as a as a tool, as an element for solutions, since it isn't necessarily focusing on the epistemic justifiable aspect internalist viewpoint, but from a metaphysical bare bones just thing in itself perspective, to use like Kantian terms. What I'm trying to say is, essences let us focus on reality while thinking about Sorites paradox in terms of connotation, denotation. Semantic reduction is just, the problem is that it's a problem of justification.
Okay, that's interesting, because when I was kind of preparing for this and writing some notes out, I was actually curious if I could turn it into kind of if there were some like internalist versus externalist things we could make out of it, because definitely seems at face value externalism is better. We're talking about mental content and semantics and things like that. So if we can avoid internalism in this case, then that's good. So it sounds like your account wants to do that. So I'm down with it.
Yeah. I think avoiding internalism also avoids rationalism and idealism, which I'm very much
Which we definitely want to do, right? Yeah. We want to stick with that sweet, sweet empiricism, right? Definitely.
Exactly.
Hell yeah. Okay, I'm down with that. Cool. So we did get that. I don't know if you want to say anything more about that, we can. If not, we can move on to just talking a little bit about maybe some other cases and other areas of philosophy where we think this is interesting. So do you have anything else in like the Aristotelian point, or?
I don't have any more. I've exhausted most of what I had to say. There obviously the objections to my case could be like more anti-essentialist, attacking the method sort of objections. Right. But those a lot of really overly used objections to essentialism have been they've been reviewed by Fine and Oderberg, so you could check them out.
Yeah. Yeah, we can talk about it definitely. Maybe in our next video, if we do a video on essentialism, we'll definitely talk about this, because I know there's one paper I was recommended arguing against essentialism, even like Kripke's variant, just like bare essentialism, not even like anything to do with theism. So we could talk about some of that too. But yeah, that's kind of the bare bones. I mean, if there are any other objections, there might be some, based on like internalist accounts of justification or whatever. But we can kind of leave that to the side for now, I guess. It could be a fun part too. But yeah, so there's a couple, I guess there's really only two cases I thought of that interest me with this, and we've talked about, I think, both of these before a little bit. For one thing, kind of like personal identity cases, and specifically arguments in ethics like surrounding abortion and even euthanasia, just a kind of general personal identity and conscious activity. Because remember we talked about abortion at one point, and you said that you thought the Sorites kind of applied there as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's start with that one. People might be wondering how this applies to like abortion and ethics, and
Yeah.
I guess the basic case may be something like, well, if we accept that it's wrong to kill persons, we don't think fetuses are persons. It obviously raises the question of at what point does it become a person? It's larger at this many weeks. It has this level of, organ activity or physical or neural activity. At what point do we have personhood? So I don't know. Do you want to add anything onto there? Why it's interesting?
And actually goes back to my previous point about the Aristotelian solution to Sorites is that the Sorites paradox applied to abortion is that it's constitutive. It's looking at it from a constitutive viewpoint, as in it's a continuous and recurring development of cells over time. But at what point do those conglomerates or clumps of cells form what we would call or what we would term a human being? And actually, a lot of Thomists and Neo-Aristotelians have used essentialist arguments to try and avoid that Sorites paradox of a person, but they don't get very far because they haven't really justified why essentialism can destroy Sorites paradox entirely. Yeah. And so it definitely applies here, just ignoring most perspectives right now, that at what point do the aggregates of cells form a human? And just like you were saying, like at what point is it from conception? Is it when it becomes a fetus, when it becomes an embryo, zygote, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? It goes on from there. There's no boundary in trying to define when a fetus is a human or not.
Yeah, I guess I prefer to think of this one because I know there's kind of been some extensive literature responding to like Oderberg on the essentialist pro-life arguments, but that's again mostly a topic for another day. I guess I'd just say my solution to this, or the solution I'd say is probably the most promising for like the pro-choice way to think about this, if we are going to take it as a Sorites case, is just to say the second option we talked about in terms of broad response is rejecting some premise. Because I tend to think, I don't think it's a problem. Like you don't really have, well, let me know if I'm wrong with this, but I just tend to think you don't really have a Sorites paradox if you set out like a clear definition of what you think entails like personhood, or call human being. I mean, personhood to me seems clearer. But say if you have something like, well, consciousness, and then we can see, kind of a posteriori identification again with science, we can kind of point out exactly when there's this level of conscious activity. And if we've already said, well, okay, at that level of conscious activity, it's a person.
Yeah.
Then we don't have any kind of like mereology problems or paradox, because it's like we've specified that up until this point it's not a person, and after this point it is. So it's kind of simple. And so it's almost like it's not even epistemicism, because epistemicism says we can't know, and this is like if we already say what we can know, then we're good. But I mean, you could take an epistemicist route too, just be like, we don't know exactly, at what point, like which amount of neurons firing, it becomes a person, but we know, once it's up and walking and talking, you can feel pain, it's a person, right?
Yeah.
So maybe there's something there, but I don't know. That's kind of just interesting, like a side point as far as an ethics case. But that, the personal identity. Well, sorry, before I go on, do you have anything else there?
Yeah, I wanted to say, like, I agree with you. Like, the best solution to Sorites in terms of the pro-life, pro-choice movement is that we do have to reject the premise. And most commonly, pro-choicers would reject the premise that life begins at conception, as most pro-life people would try and designate in order to avoid their Sorites paradox. So, and it does work if you deny that. It's reasonable and coherent to say that life begins at conception because there isn't any identifiable aggregate of cells that could form organs and form organ systems and also exhibit characteristic human functions like consciousness or humor, rationality, et cetera, et cetera.
Right. Yeah, there was a whole like Yale professor of biology lecture on this, of how like, life is to be understood in kind of cyclical evolutionary terms and not as just kind of this brute cutoff point, which may add some points to the Sorites case against it, and maybe if you take it as more cyclical. But
Oh, absolutely.
yeah. So, but even not with, we talked about like abortion is kind of like the adding grains, but we can also think about it in terms of taking away. If we think of like, getting to like old age and like dementia, I think just like general personal identity cases, like, at what point, at what stage of loss of consciousness do we no longer have persons? Because obviously a brain dead body we don't think is a person. But if that person's, maybe just has like some mental disorder, then it still is. So we can kind of go the other way with it too. So one of the things that most interests me about this paradox, I guess, is sort of the implications it may have for applied ethics, right, and personal identity, and kind of like, okay, well, when do we get persons and when do they go away? So that's one of the more interesting parts about it for me. And then I think the only other one I had, and if you have any, we can talk about this, but I was just thinking like general, which I've referenced before, Mariology and metaphysics. So I was thinking specifically like ship of Theseus problems, like at what point have we rebuilt a ship? At what point have we taken it away? And it's a little different, right? But Mariology still, it's like, okay, how many atoms do we have to add to get a chair? And then so, so I wonder if there's like maybe like an essentialist understanding of Mariology that plays in here, or if you have anything to add on that, just kind of metaphysical points.
For mereology and essentialism, honestly, there isn't really much of a relation there, because since essence wants to, or at least when you posit essences, you're positing an explanation for the unity and integral, or I would say the integral unity of the universe. That's when you posit, when you posit essence. But when it comes to particulars or parts creating an aggregate whole that is distinct from the parts, it's weird how essence can fit in there, and it possibly could, like the parts being such like accidental or essential properties, and that distinct aggregate being essence itself, etc., etc., etc. But to try and create a mereological ontology of essence like that is, we're gonna be here all day.
Right. Yeah, that's quite the project. Yeah, because essences seem a little bit more, I don't know, kind of like cut at the seams maybe than kind of like those weird Mariology problems. I guess we could just be Mariological nihilists, like Dustin Crummett, who I've had on a couple times. It's just like, well, obviously chairs don't exist, and I'm like, oh yeah, all right, cool. I guess you don't have to worry about there's no essence of chair if chairs don't exist. Boom, big brain time. But
there is just atom.
There's just atom. There's just the essence of atoms. That's pretty good. It. Yeah, that's something I like to think about that more a little bit too. In addition to kind of the broad problem, just the relation of vagueness to Mariology, because I feel like there is something there with ship of Theseus of thinking like, okay, well, obviously if I replace all the planks, then it's a different ship. Maybe some people might think that, but like before I replace that last plank, it's still the same ship, or it's not completely a new one. I'm not endorsing those. I don't know if anybody does. I'm just saying like there's kind of some potentially interesting problems with Mariology there. But yeah, I don't know. It'd be fun to think about that more.
Absolutely, and because they highlight what Sorites paradox is trying to achieve, which is namely, the vagueness of language and the vagueness of describing the corresponding things to language.
Yeah. The kind of that point we talked about earlier, the semantics and metaphysics is kind of definitely probably the main thing I do want to think about more. Is just like, because intuitively I very much liked that semantic approach, but I'm not sure, as you said, that may not be quite as explanatory virtuous as we want. But okay, yeah. Anything else? I mean, I think we've covered most stuff. I don't know if there's anything else we want to talk about. We talked about so far what Sorites paradox is, why it's important to think about, and kind of why vagueness creates problems in other areas of philosophy, how kind of this has implications for metaphysics, language, and logic. And we even talked a little about epistemology, talked about essences, grounding, different
We haven't
ontologies.
talked about its application to philosophy of religion.
Oh, we have not. Okay, yeah, of course.
Fun.
How did I leave that out? That's our stuff right there. All right, what do you think are some of the big applications to philosophy of religion? I'm trying to think of a couple. There's some, but yeah, what do you think?
Attributes of God. Absolutely. I've been thinking about this for a long time, and Sorites paradox really shines when it comes to the investigation of God's attributes and at what point we define the attributes of God clearly and distinctly.
Yeah. Ooh, yeah, that's interesting, because I guess what pops to mind for me immediately with that is like Josh Rasmussen's like no limits arguments or something.
Exactly.
Like saying, Yeah, I think he kind of, because he kind of levels a sort of paradox like this, where he says, if this necessary being can do, exercise this much power, like n plus one, then it's not omnipotent, but n plus two. But like there's no reason to have an arbitrary limit. So if we just remove that arbitrary limit, then it has unlimited power, but that's simpler because we don't have this arbitrary, like, well, this being is power of the degree n to the 10th degree, but not the 11th or beyond. And it's like, okay, well, why does it have that much power or not? So maybe it's a problem for non-theists when we do want to impose arbitrary limits on, like, say, of course, actually, I don't think they're arbitrary. I think they'd probably be like metaphysically necessary or something, or there's a case to be made there at least. But say we do want to bite the bullet on arbitrariness, because there actually are arguments for metaphysically necessary arbitrary limits, which I think is interesting. Say we did want to bite that bullet, it could be a problem for us. Like, okay, well, why does this being have this much power but not a little bit more, right, or a little bit less? But that works with all attributes of God, don't you think? I mean, like all power, all knowing. Why does it know everything except this fact?
Yeah. Why exactly? At what point does or I would say, at what point does an idea in the mind of God become necessary? At what point does an idea in the mind of God become contingent, or other concerning his omnipotence? At what point can he have the power to create nature, and at what point can he have the power to create perfect nature and even perfecter nature, et cetera, et cetera? Like, where's the limit? How do we clearly define it? And what was it? His timelessness. At what time does he exist at? And exactly why should it be at this time? If it's no time, why should it be no time? Especially if creation has time, which also goes back into the vagueness of his omnipotence.
Right. Yeah, because if you're like, if you're not a classical theist, you want to say God has like temporal moments, like successive temporal moments in his life. Why did he choose to create an X temporal moment instead of Y? And barring some of the problems there are for classical theism, of which there are many, that's kind of like there's some other like sort of vague ones with non-classical ones. It's like, okay, why does God create now as opposed to, that's a kind of a classic issue.
Like Joe's objection with what was it, with the Cambridge change argument, and also the intrinsic necessary features argument, like
the aloneness.
Aloneness, and I think that's the aloneness, but the intrinsic distinct attributes of God argument, where it says, like, if God has two ideas in his mind, then he has two completely distinct and contingent attributes of himself. Like, those also Sorites paradox also plays or highlights that, in that exactly what attribute can be necessary and what attribute can we call contingent. If there is no contingent properties, then exactly at what point can we call God necessary? And if they go on, the metaphysical tangent of, well, he's pure act, at what point does something become purely actual and devoid of matter and potentiality, etc.?
Yeah, and it's like, could there be non-God objects that like gain pure actuality? And if so,
yeah, exactly.
How can you like remove? Could we do the counting backwards, like remove all potentiality somehow? Like, how do we do that? Man, yeah, that's interesting. We should, we could probably do another whole thing too on philosophy of religion and vagueness and God's attributes. Because I think about like aseity, like radical independence. Like, why are these, attributes radically independent of all of the reality, but some aren't? Like, wait. Because if you're not a classical theist, like, why are some attributes of God contingent, and why are some necessary? Why are they still radically separate? Why do they have varying explanations? Some do, some don't. So it's interesting, man. That's a whole thing too. Which we'll talk about that in our next video too, probably on the journey. I don't know exactly what we're gonna call that one yet. We'll figure it out. But
yeah.
That'll be a surprise, viewers. You've probably gleaned a little bit of an idea, but we'll talk about some philosophy of religion stuff a lot in another upcoming video. But this has been fun. I'm thinking maybe we should do because I like these kind of like shorter, but like not short, but shorter videos, kind of talking about something that's not specifically religion, just kind of doing some general philosophy. I love that. So I'm thinking maybe it'd be fun to do like just a series, like Logical Paradox Fridays or something with Drew on the channel.
Oh yeah, dude, that'd be awesome. Because I love me my paradoxes.
I know. I was thinking the next we should do like Newcomb's box or something. That'd be really fun.
Oh yeah,
that'd be a fun one. Or we could even go through multiple paradoxes in a day. But yeah,
and we could do like non-logical paradoxes, like mathematical paradoxes. I love it. Scientific paradoxes, like Schrodinger's cat.
Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely. Xeno. We could get into like Grim Reaper, like do kind of like super task infinity. Just do everything. Let's do everything. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm thinking it'll be a thing. Maybe not like Fridays, but we don't have to set a day for it. Just the weekly Paradox Hour with Drew. It'll be like having a guest on the podcast. But yeah, I think that's going to be fun. And this was really enlightening discussion. Thanks for coming on. I mean, do we have anything else, or is this? I think we're good.
No, I'm good. I've exhausted all the mental faculties that contain Sorites paradox.
You've not perverted your yeah. It's good. Yeah, no, good. You got the Aristotelian, got that out there, so that's good to have. You want to plug any people can reach you if they want to talk about these things more, or read any more of your content?
Yeah, just reach me at my Instagram, Andreas_Scholastica. You could probably edit that in or something. I don't know, but yeah, just reach me.
Yeah,
there.
I can probably link you in the description or something. I'll go ahead and do that. I'll link Drew's Instagram. He's got some posts up on some stuff. Some older, some new. He's been working on, and I'm sure you'll come out with some more. So that'll all be enlightening for everybody.
Absolutely.
So yeah, check us out there. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time for Logical Paradox. Maybe that'll be part of the paradox is there's not any one specific day it's at, but it's always the same day at the same time. I don't know. We'll figure something out. But anyways, here we go. This is always a challenge.